Section 29 of Library of the World's Best Mystery and Detective Stories, Volume 6. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Reading by Lars Rolander. Library of the World's Best Mystery and Detective Stories, Volume 6, by Julian Hawthorne, Editor. Section 29. The Duel of the Two Sharpers from the 1001 Nights. There was once in the city of Baghdad a man hight Al-Marwazi, who was a sharper and ruined the folk with his rogueries, and he was renowned in all quarters for knavery. He went out one day carrying a load of small pebbles, and swore to himself that he would not return to his lodging till he had sold it at the price of raisins. Now there was in another city a second sharper hight Al-Razi, one of its worst, who went out the same day bearing a load of round stones, anent which he too had sworn to himself that he would not sell it but at the price of sun-dried figs. So the twain fared on with that which was by them, and ceased not going till they met in one of the khans, and one complained to other of what he had suffered on travel in quest of gain, and of the little demand for his wares. Now each of them had it in mind to cheat his fellow. So the man of Marv said to the man of Ray, "Wilt thou sell me that?" He said, "Yes," and the other continued, "And wilt thou buy that which is with me?" The man of Ray consented. So they agreed upon this, and each of them sold to his mate that which was with him in exchange for the other's, after which they bade farewell and both fared forth. As soon as the twain were out of sight, they examined their loads to see what was therein, and one of them found that he had a load of small pebbles, and the other that he had a load of round stones, whereupon each of them turned back in quest of his fellow. They met again in the khan, and laughing at each other, cancelled their bargain. Then they agreed to enter into partnership, and that all they had of money and other good should be in common share and share alike. Then quoth Al-Razi to Al-Marwazi, "Come with me to my city, for that 'tis nearer than thine." So he went with him, and when he arrived at his quarters, he said to his wife and household and neighbours, "This is my brother, who hath been absent in the land of Khorasan and is come back." And he abode with him in all honour for a space of 3 days. On the 4th day Al-Razi said to him, "Know, O my brother, that I purpose to do something." The other asked, "What is it?" And the first answered, "I mean to feign myself dead, and do thou go to the bazar and hire 2 porters and a bier. Then take me up and go about the streets and markets with my body and collect alms on my account." Note: Moslems are bound to see true believers decently buried, and the poor often beg alms for the funeral. End of note. Accordingly the Marw man repaired to the market, and fetching that which he sought, returned to the Ray man's house, where he found his fellow cast down in the entrance passage, with his beard tied and his eyes shut, and his complexion was paled and his limbs were loose. So he deemed him really dead and shook him, but he spoke not. Then he took a knife and pricked his feet, but he budged not. Presently said Al-Razi, "What is this, O fool?" And said Al-Marwazi, "I deemed thou wast dead in very deed." Al-Razi cried, "Get thee to business and leave funning." So he took him up and went with him to the market, and collected alms for him that day till eventide, when he bore him back to his abode and waited till the morrow. Next morning he again took up the bier and walked round with it as before, in quest of charity. Presently the chief of police, who was of those who had given him alms on the previous day, met him. So he was angered and fell on the porters and beat them and took the dead body, saying, "I will bury him and win reward in heaven." So his followers took him up and, carrying him to the police officer, fetched grave diggers who dug him a grave. Then they brought him a shroud and perfumes and fetched an old man of the quarter to wash him. So the Shaykh recited over him the appointed prayers and, laying him on the bench, washed him and shrouded him. When the dead man found himself alone, he sprang up as he were a Satan and, donning the corpse washer's dress, took the cups and water can and wrapped them up in the napkins. Then he clapped his shroud under his armpit and went out. The doorkeepers thought that he was the washer and asked him, "Hast thou made an end of the washing, so we may acquaint the Emir?" The sharper answered, "Yes," and made off to his abode, where he found the Marwman awooing his wife and saying to her, "By the life, thou wilt never again look upon his face, for the best reason that by this time he is buried. I myself escaped not from them but after toil and trouble, and if he speak, they will do him to death." Quoth she, "And what wouldst thou have of me?" And quoth he, "Be mine, for I am better than thy husband." Now when the Rayman heard this, he rushed in upon them, and when Al Marwazi saw him, he wondered at him and said to him, "How didst thou make thine escape?" Accordingly he told him the trick he had played, and they abode talking of that which they had collected from the folk, and indeed they had gotten great store of money. Then said the man of Marw, "In very sooth mine absence hath been prolonged and lief would I return to my own land." Al Razi said, "As thou willst," and the other rejoined, "Let us divide the monies we have made and do thou go with me to my home, so I may show thee my tricks and my works." Replied the man of Rayy, "Come to morrow and we will divide the coin." So the Marwman went away and the other turned to his wife and said to her, "We have collected us great plenty of money, and the dog would fain take the half of it; but such thing shall never be, for my mind hath been changed against him since I heard him making love to thee. Now, therefore, I propose to play him a trick and enjoy all the money, and do thou not oppose me." She replied, "'Tis well," and he said to her, "To morrow, at peep o' day, I will feign myself dead, and do thou cry aloud and tear thy hair, whereupon the folk will flock to me. Then lay me out and bury me, and when the folk are gone away from the grave, dig down to me and take me, and fear not for me, as I can abide without harm 2 days in the tomb niche." Whereto she made answer, "Do e'en whatso thou wilt." Accordingly, when it was the dawn hour, she bound his beard and, spreading a veil over him, shrieked aloud, whereupon the people of the quarter flocked to her, men and women. Presently up came Al Marwazi for the division of the money, and hearing the keening asked, "What may be the news?" Quoth they, "Thy brother is dead," and quoth he in himself, "The accursed fellow cozeneth me, so he may get all the coin for himself; but I will presently do with him what shall soon requicken him." Then he tore the bosom of his robe and bared his head, weeping and saying, "Alas, my brother, ah! Alas, my chief, ah! Alas, my lord, ah!" And he went in to the men, who rose and condoled with him. Then he accosted the Rayman's wife and said to her, "How came his death to occur?" Said she, "I know nothing except that when I arose in the morning I found him dead." Moreover, he questioned her of the money which was with her, but she cried, "I have no knowledge of this and no tidings." So he sat down at his fellow sharper's head and said to him, Know, O Razi, that I will not leave thee till after 10 days with their nights, wherein I will wake and sleep by thy grave. So rise, and don't be a fool." But he answered him not, and the man of Marv drew his knife and fell to sticking it into the other's hands and feet, purposing to make him move. But he stirred not, and he presently grew weary of this, and determined that the sharper was really dead. However, he still had his suspicions, and said to himself, "This fellow is falsing me, so he may enjoy all the money." Therewith he began to prepare the body for burial, and bought for it perfumes and whatso was needed. Then they brought him to the washing place, and Al Marwazi came to him, and heating water till it boiled and bubbled and a third of it was evaporated, fell to pouring it on his skin, so that it turned bright red and lively blue and was blistered. But he abode still motionless. Presently they wrapped him in the shroud and set him on the bier, which they took up and bearing him to the burial place, placed him in the grave niche and filled in the earth, after which the folk dispersed. But the Marw man and the widow abode by the tomb, weeping, and ceased not sitting till sundown, when the woman said to him, "Come, let us hie us home, for this weeping will not profit us, nor will it restore the dead." He replied to her, "By Allah, I will not budge hence till I have slept and waked by this tomb 10 days with their nights." When she heard this his speech, she feared lest he should keep his word and his oath, and so her husband perish. But she said in her mind, "This one dissembleth, and I leave him and return to my house. He will tarry by him a little while and go away." And Al Marwazi said to her, "Arise thou and hie thee home." So she arose and repaired to her house, while the man of Marw abode in his place till the night was half spent, when he said to himself, "How long? Yet how can I let this knavish dog die and lose the money? Better I open the tomb on him and bring him forth and take my due of him by dint of grievous beating and torment." Accordingly he dug him up and pulled him forth of the grave, after which he betook himself to a garden hard by the burial ground and cut thence staves and palm fronds. Then he tied the dead man's legs and laid on to him with a staff and beat him a grievous beating. But the body never budged. When the time grew longsome on him, his shoulders became aweary, and he feared lest some one of the watch passing on his round should surprise and seize him. So he took up Al Razi and carrying him forth to the cemetery, stayed not till he came to the Magyans' mortuary place, and casting him down in a tower of silence, rained heavy blows upon him till his shoulders failed him. But the other stirred not. Then he seated him by his side and rested, after which he rose and renewed the beating upon him. And thus he did till the end of the night, but without making him move. Now, as destiny decreed, a band of robbers, whose wont it was, when they had stolen anything, to resort to that place and there divide their loot, came thither in early dawn, according to their custom. They numbered 10, and they had with them much wealth, which they were carrying. When they approached the Tower of Silence, they heard a noise of blows within it, and their captain cried, "This is a Magian whom the angels are tormenting." So they entered the cemetery, and as soon as they arrived over against him, the man of Marw feared lest they should be the watchmen come upon him. Therefore he fled and stood among the tombs. The robbers advanced to the place and finding the man of Ray bound by the feet and by him some 70 sticks, wondered at this with exceeding wonder and said, "Allah confound thee! This was a miscreant, a man of many crimes, for earth has rejected him from her womb. and by my life he is yet fresh. This is his first night in the tomb, and the angels were tormenting him but now. So whoso of you hath a sin upon his soul, let him beat him, by way of offering to Almighty Allah." The robbers said, "We be sinners one and all." So each of them went up to the corpse and dealt it about 100 blows, one saying the while, "This is for my father," and another laid on to him, crying, "This is for my grandfather," whilst a third muttered, "This is for my brother," and a fourth exclaimed, "This is for my mother." And they gave not taking turns at him, and beating him till they were weary, whilst Al Marwazi stood laughing and saying in himself, "'Tis not I alone who have entered into default against him. There is no majesty and there is no might save in Allah, the glorious, the great." Then the robbers applied themselves to sharing their loot, wherein was a sword, which caused them to fall out anent the man who should take it. Quoth the captain, "'Tis my rede that we make proof of it, so an it be a fine blade, we shall know its worth, and if it be worthless, we shall know that." Whereto they said, "Try it on this corpse, for it is fresh." So the captain took the sword and drawing it, brandished and made a false cut with it. But when the man of Rayy saw this, he felt sure of death and said in his mind, "I have borne the washing slab and the boiling water, and the pricking with the knife point, and the grave niche and its straightness, and all this, trusting in Allah that I might be delivered from death. And indeed I have been delivered. But the sword I may not suffer, seeing that one stroke of it will make me a dead man." So saying, he sprang to his feet and seizing a thigh bone of one departed, shouted at the top of his voice, "O ye dead ones, take them to yourselves!" And he smote one of them, whilst his mate of Marv smote another, and they cried out at them and buffeted them on their neck napes, whereupon the robbers left that which was with them of loot and ran away. And indeed their wits took flight for terror, and they ceased not running till they came forth of the Magian's mortuary ground and left it a parsang's length behind them, when they halted, trembling and affrighted for the muchness of that which had befallen them of fear and awe of the dead. As for Al Razi and Al Marwazi, they made peace each with other and sat down to share the spoil. Quoth the man of Marv, "I will not give thee a dirham of this money till thou pay me my due of the monies that be in thy house." And quoth the man of Rayy, "I will do naught of the kind, nor will I withdraw this from aught of my due." So they fell out thereupon and disputed each with other, and either of the twain went saying to his fellow, "I will not give thee a dirham." Wherefore words ran high between them and the brawl was prolonged. Meanwhile, when the robbers halted, one of them said to the others, "Let us go back and see." And the captain said, "This thing is impossible of the dead. Never heard we that they came to life in such way. Return we and take our monies, for that the dead have no need of money." And they were divided in opinion as to returning. But presently one said, "Indeed our weapons are gone, and we may not prevail against them, and will not draw near the place. Only let one of us go look at it, and if he hear no sound of them, let him suggest to us what we shall do." At this they agreed that they should send a man of them, and assigned him for such mission 2 parts of the plunder. Accordingly he returned to the burial ground and gave not over going till he stood at the door of the Tower of Silence, when he heard the words of Al Marwazi to his fellow, "I will not give thee a single dirham of the money." The other said the same, and they were occupied with brawling and abuse and talk. So the robber returned in haste to his mates, who said, "What is behind thee?" Quoth he, "Get you gone and run for your lives, O fools, and save yourselves. Much people of the dead are come to life, and between them are words and brawls." Hereat the robbers fled, whilst the two sharpers returned to the man of Ray's house, and made peace, and added the robbers' spoil to the moneys they had gained, and lived a length of time. End of Section 29. Read by Lars Rolander. Section 30 of Library of the World's Best Mystery and Detective Stories, Volume 6. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Reading by Lars Rolander. Library of the World's Best Mystery and Detective Stories, Volume 6 by Julian Hawthorne, Editor. Section 30. The Lady and the Kazi. From the Persian. During the reign of Sultan Mahomed Subagtarchin in Ghaznin, a man was travelling from Azerbaijan to Hindustan, when he arrived in Ghaznin. He was much pleased with the climate, so he decided to settle there, and as he had great experience in commerce, he went to the bazaar and became a broker, and was very successful in business. He intended to marry, and fortune being propitious to him, he entered into a matrimonial alliance with a virtuous and handsome young woman. By degrees his business also became more and more flourishing, and having accumulated much wealth, he was numbered among the richest merchants. He wished to extend his transactions to Hindustan and send goods to that country, but as he had no connections or intimate friends in Ghaznin who might take charge of his wife till his return, this thought troubled him greatly, and as he considered it the first duty of a respectable man to be on his guard on this subject, and not to hazard his reputation and honour, he determined not to start on his journey till he had provided an asylum for his spouse. Now, since the Kazi of the city was a man noted for his piety, virtue, and honour, he said to himself, "I cannot do better than entrust the keeping of my wife to so godly and honest a man, who is a magistrate and a churchman, and enjoys the esteem of the rich and the poor. Let her remain in his house till I return from my journey." He hastened to make his obeisance to the Kazi, and said, "O President of the Judgment, seat of truth and piety, by whose talented and searching disposition the explanations of religious and secular questions are flowing, and by whose essentially holy authority and intelligence the commendatory and prohibitory laws are corroborated, may your righteous opinion always remain the guide of those who seek to walk in the straight way of piety. I, your humble servant, am an inhabitant of this city, and it is my intention to undertake a journey to Hindustan. I have a young wife, the leaves of whose modesty and virtue are bound up in the splendid volume of her natural excellence. But as I have nobody who might protect and take care of her, and also because she might fall under the obloquy of false tongues, I flatter myself that she might find a refuge under the guardianship of your lordship." The Kazi placed the seal of acquiescence upon this request, and said that he would take care of her. The man furnished his wife with all the necessary expenses for 1 year, delivered her to the Kazi, and started on his journey. The lady spent her whole time in the house of the Kazi in prayer and devotion, and nearly a whole year had elapsed without the breeze of a single profane glance having blown on the venerable abode of her face, and without her having ever heard the bird of a voice in the foliage of her ears. Till one day the Kazi unexpectedly made his appearance and looked at her, when he perceived her Layla-like beauty sitting within the black mansion of her masked ringlets, and her sweet tenderness mounted upon the palfrey of attractiveness and melancholy. The Kazi's intellect became troubled, and Ferrad-like he began to dig the biston of his soul, which was melting and burning in the censer of distraction. He was anxious to make overtures against her virtue, but being aware of her whole nature and chastity, he durst not attempt it. Nevertheless, when the wife of the Kazi one day absented herself to visit the public baths, and had left the lady alone to take care of the house, he was so completely dominated by his unlawful passion, that he threw skyward the turban of concupiscence, and said: "The desired game for which I looked in the skies has now on earth fallen into the net of my good fortune." The Kazi locked the door, and commenced his stratagem by complimenting her modesty, and continued to address her in the following strain: "Virtuous lady, the reputation of my honesty and piety has spread in the world and penetrated all corners. Neither could the charms of the paradisical houris seduce my righteous disposition from the road of firm determination, or impel me to transgress the laws of purity. Then why do you avoid me so much? If the absence of intelligence and of the knowledge of the true state of things keep your face veiled with a curtain of bashfulness, my obedience to the laws of God, and my fear of eternal punishment at the day of resurrection, prohibit me from allowing the fire of sensuality to be kindled within me. I would not disturb your peace even with the sinful glance of my eye. Be of good cheer, and throw aside the veil of apprehension from your face, because there is no danger of sinning, and although it is against the law of God and the Prophet to exact services from guests, yet since you belong to the house, and I am dependent on your kindness, I would request you to procure me some food, for I am hungry." The woman placed the prohibitory veil of bashfulness on her face, and waited upon the Kazi with all due modesty. She put the meal before him, and retired to a corner. The Kazi had provided himself with a drug which deprives of his senses any one who tastes it, and said to the woman: "You know that three kinds of persons will be rejected from the mercy of God on the day of resurrection, and will be subjected to endless tortures. Firstly, he who eats alone; secondly, he who sleeps alone; and thirdly, he who travels alone. And till now it has never happened to me that I did any of these three things. Since I am now eating alone, and anyone who does this has the devil for his companion, and to whomsoever this happens, his faith will be endangered. Why should you not, in order to free me from the snares of the devil, defile your hands by partaking of this meal?" He did not cease to invite her till she sat down near the table and helped herself to some food. The Kazi took this opportunity to throw some of the medicine into the plate. After the unfortunate woman had swallowed a few morsels, she felt herself fainting, and wanting to get up from the table, her feet refused to bear her, and she fell senseless to the ground. The Kazi quickly gathered up the articles that were on the table, and meditated worse things, when he suddenly heard noises on the outside. This greatly disturbed him, and he was much embarrassed where to conceal the woman so that nobody might discover the circumstance. Now the Kazi happened to keep his money and valuables in a subterranean room, which was situated exactly under the apartment in which he was. Nobody knew anything about this place except himself. He opened the trapdoor, thrust the woman into it, and again covered the floor with a carpet. Then he went out and saw that his family had returned from the bath. The Kazi said: "Why did you all leave the house empty?" They answered: "We have left the wife of the merchant to take care of the place." The Kazi said: "It is 2 hours since I arrived at home, and have seen no one. Why do you trust such a person? She may have taken away something." They were all astonished, and said that she was not such a woman, and wondered what had become of her. While this talk was going on, the husband of that woman, having just returned from his journey to Hindustan, came at that moment to the house of the Kazi to inquire for his wife. The Kazi said: "It is some time since your wife has left the house without giving us notice or asking permission." The merchant said: "O Kazi, this is not the time to crack jokes. Deliver to me my wife." The Kazi swore an oath and affirmed that he was in earnest. The merchant said, I am too well acquainted with the nature and disposition of my wife ever to believe her to be capable of such a trick. There must be something else the matter. The Kazi got angry and replied, It is I who must be offended, you foolish man. Why do you talk nonsense and uselessly insult us? Go and see where your wife is. As the merchant was greatly attached to his spouse, and the smoke of distress was beginning to ascend from the oven of his brains, he tore the collar of patience and hastened to make his complaint to the Sultan, and prostrating himself upon the carpet of supplication, he said, O exalted and happy monarch, my felicity be the servant of your palace. The Kazi of the city has done me injustice, greater than the blast of a tornado of the west. If it be permitted, I shall explain the injustice of that mean-spirited wretch. The Sultan said, Bring forward your complaint, that I may become acquainted with it. The merchant said, I am a native of Azerbaijan, and it was the fame of the justice and the protection which the poor obtain at the hands of your majesty that induced me to settle in this country, and it is some time since I dwelt under the shadow of your majesty's protection. I had a beautiful and modest wife, and intending to travel to Hindustan, I committed her 1 year ago to the charge of the Kazi. Now I have again returned, but he, being deceived by his covetousness, refuses to give up to me my wife. The Sultan ordered the Kazi to be brought into his presence, but the latter, suspecting what would happen, suborned by the promise of money several vagabonds to testify when called upon that they had seen the merchant's wife absent herself from the Kazi's house 3 months ago. When the Kazi arrived, the Sultan asked him what kind of a complaint the merchant had against him. The Kazi said, May the torch of your majesty's welfare be luminous and the castle of opposition ruinous. This man has entrusted his wife to me, and it is nearly 3 months since she went out of my house without giving any notice, and up to this time she has not come back. We have been unable to discover any traces of her. The merchant answered, This is contrary to the nature of my wife, and I do not believe it. The Sultan said, Who are the witnesses? The Kazi answered that several neighbors and householders of the vicinity were acquainted with the fact, and wrote down their names. At a sign of the Sultan to a chamberlain, these witnesses were brought in, and they confirmed the assertion of the Kazi. Then the Sultan said to the merchant, As the Kazi has established his assertion by witnesses, your complaint falls to the ground. Upon this the merchant retired disappointed. The Sultan was in the habit of perambulating the bazaars and streets of the city occasionally, in disguise, to mix among the people, and thus discover what they thought of him. That night he left his palace according to his wont and walked about. He happened to pass near the door of a shop where boys were playing the game of the king and his vizier. One of the children was made king and said to the others, I am king and you are all under my authority. You must not seek to evade my commands. Another boy said, If you give unjust judgments like Sultan Mahomed, we shall soon depose you. The other asked, What injustice has Sultan Mahomed done? He answered, Today the affair of a merchant came before the Sultan. This merchant has confided his wife to the keeping of the Kazi, and he hid her in his own house. The Sultan called for witnesses, when the Kazi gained his cause by bringing into court witnesses whom he had previously bribed. It is a great pity that people should have the administration of justice in their hands who are unable to distinguish between right and wrong. Had I been in the place of the Sultan, I would very quickly have discovered the truth or falsehood of the witnesses of the Kazi. When the Sultan had heard the conversation of these children, he sighed and returned to his palace in great agitation of mind. Next morning, as soon as it was daylight, he sent somebody to fetch the boy. The boy came, and the Sultan received him in a very friendly way, saying, This day you shall be my lieutenant, the whole day from morning till evening, and I intend to allow you to sit in judgment and to act entirely according to your own will." Then the Sultan whispered to a chamberlain to invite the merchant again to state his complaint against the Kazi. The merchant came and did so. The witnesses were again called for, whom the Kazi again brought into court. The Kazi wished to take a seat, but the boy said, "Ho, Master Kazi, it is a long time since the leading strings of judicial power and the power of tying and untying the knotty points of law have been in your hands. Why do you seem to be so ignorant of legal customs? You have been brought into this court as a party in a lawsuit, and not as an assessor. It is the rule that you should stand below on an equality with your accuser till the court breaks up, and then you should obey whatever its decision might be." The Kazi went and placed himself near the merchant. Then the merchant proffered his complaint, and the Kazi again affirmed that the woman had abandoned the house 3 months ago. The boy said, "Have you any witnesses?" The Kazi beckoned to his followers and said, "These are the witnesses." The boy called one of the witnesses and asked him in a subdued voice whether he had seen the woman. He said, "Yes." Then he inquired further what signs there were on her person, stature, or face. The man became embarrassed and said, "She has a mole on her forehead, one of her teeth is wanting, she is of a fresh complexion, tall and slender." The boy asked, "What time of day was it when she went away from the house of the Kazi?" He answered, "Morning." The boy said, "Remain in this place." Then he called for another witness, of whom he also asked the description, and got the following answer: "She is of low stature, lean, her cheeks are white and red, she has a mole near the lips, and she left the house in the afternoon." Having placed this individual in another corner, he called for a third witness, whose evidence contradicted both the others, and gradually he examined all of them and found them disagreeing in everything. The Sultan was sitting by the side of the boy and heard all. When the hearing of the witnesses were completed, the boy said, "You God-forgetting wretches, why do you give false evidence? Let the instruments of torture be brought forward, that we may find out the truth." As soon as they heard the name of torture mentioned, they all offered to say the truth, and acknowledged themselves to be a set of poor fellows, whom the Kazi had bribed with a sum of money, and had instructed what to say. They also confessed that they knew nothing whatever about the woman. The boy called the Kazi and asked him what he had to say in this business. The Kazi commenced to tremble all over his body and said, "The truth is as I have stated it." The boy said, "Our Kazi is a bold man, and his haughtiness hinders him from acknowledging the truth. The instruments of punishment ought to be made use of." When the Kazi heard this, the fear of torture greatly distressed him, and he confessed the truth. Upon this the boy kissed the floor of good manners with the lips of obedience, and said, "The remainder of this affair is to be settled by the Sultan." The Sultan was much pleased with the acuteness and intelligence of the boy, and ordered the Kazi to be beheaded and all his property to be given to the wife of that merchant. The boy was treated kindly and educated, until by degrees he won the whole confidence of the Sultan, and became one of his greater favorites. End of Section 30. Read by Lars Rolander.
Section 31 of the Library of the World's Best Mystery and Detective Stories, Volume 6. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For information or to volunteer, visit LibriVox.org. Reading by Mary Schneider. Library of the World's Best Mystery and Detective Stories, Volume 6, edited by Julian Hawthorne. Section 31, Mahaushadha, from the Tibetan. One day the king went into the park with his wives, and enjoyed himself there together with them. One of them took off a string of pearls worth 100,000 pieces of money, and hung it on a spray of an asoka tree. While sporting with the king, she forgot about it and left it there. At midnight, after she had gone back to the palace with the king, she remembered that she had left her necklace in the forest. Meanwhile it had been carried off to the top of a tree by a female monkey. The king ordered his men to hasten to the forest and bring back the necklace. They went there, but they did not find it. Now a beggar had gone there in search of the remnants of the food of which other men had made a meal. As he came forth from the forest, after partaking of such food, the king's men arrested him. As no one else was to be seen there, they called on him to render up the necklace. Although he protested that he had not taken it, had not even seen it, yet he was beaten with fists and stakes, and then thrown into prison. Tormented by hunger, he reflected that unless he contrived some cunning way of escape, he would die there of starvation. So he said to the jailer that he had, it was true, taken the pearl necklace, but that he had given it to such and such a young merchant. Him also the king's men summoned, and the two men were set fast connected by wooden fetters. The merchant used to receive from home dainty food. While he was partaking of it, the beggar asked him for some. But the merchant reviled him, saying, "It is all very well for you to accuse me of theft in order that I may nourish you with my food. I will give you none of it." And having thus spoken, he ate it all up. After this, when the merchant wished to change his place, and said, "Let us stand up and move," the beggar replied, "I will not listen to your words. I shall not get up." Then said the merchant, "Henceforward will I behave so that you will be contented." Thus, with friendly words and with an oath, he won over the beggar, and was able to do as he wished. The next day the merchant sent home orders to provide in future food enough for 2 persons. Thereat the beggar was highly pleased, and he reflected that in former times he used to wander about the whole city without being able to find the means of filling his belly, but now food and drink in plenty were at hand. While they so enjoyed themselves, a further desire arose within them. They thought that in order to have still more pleasure they must call in a lute player. So the beggar accused a lute player also of having taken the string of pearls. Then the king's men cast him also into the prison. After some time the others besought the beggar to find some means whereby they might become free, saying that in that case he should want for nothing. He promised to do so, and bethought himself that no one could be of use except Mahaushadha. So he told the king's men that Mahaushadha's son had likewise taken part in the affair, and they sent for him also. When Mahaushadha heard that his son had been imprisoned, he felt that he must certainly go to the place, for if he did not do so his son would fret himself. On arriving there he asked the king what offense his son had committed. The king replied that he had been imprisoned on the testimony of the beggar with respect to the stolen pearl necklace. When Mahaushadha had become fully acquainted with the contrivance of the captives, he said to the king, "The theft has not been committed by any of these people. Let them all go free on my word." So they were released. After this he went out to the park, and came to the spot, to the very tree where they had been before. When he looked closely at the tree, he perceived a female monkey sitting at the top of it. Then he felt sure that this animal had taken the string of pearls, and that it must be enticed to come down by some artifice. So he asked the king to go there with his wife, and when there to hang a necklace round her neck. When that was done, the monkey, as it sat on the tree top, hung the pearl necklace round its neck. Then Mahaushadha told the king's wife to dance. When she did so, the monkey on the tree top also began to dance. but still the string of pearls did not fall from off its neck. In order to bring that about, Mahaushadha asked the king to make his wife, as she danced, hang down her head. Then the monkey also began to dance about with its head hanging down, whereupon the string of pearls fell down off its neck. Full of joy, the king embraced Mahaushadha and bestowed much property upon him. End of section 31.
Section 32 of Library of the World's Best Mystery and Detective Stories, Volume 6. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Carolyn. Library of the World's Best Mystery and Detective Stories, Volume 6, by Julian Hawthorne, Editor. Section 32. Avicenna and the Observant Young Man. From the Turkish. When Abu Sinna Avicenna, the foremost Arabic physician and philosopher, who lived 980 to 1037, was in Ispahan in the 398th year of the Hejre, that powerful person, Alai et Daulet Abu Ja'fer Delime, was its governor. At that time, distinctions and marks of regard were bestowed on Abu Sinna without ceasing. One day the Sultan took from his waist a rich and valuable belt, and bestowed it upon that excellent Shaykh. This the latter afterwards gave to one of the Sultan's own attendants. The Sultan, observing it on the individual, inquired how he came by it. The man replied that he had received it from the Shaykh as a present. The Sultan was greatly displeased, and rebuked the attendant severely for having accepted it. At the same time he swore to take the Shaykh's life for caring so little for his gifts. But one of the Shaykh's friends, giving him information of what had occurred, he acted on the proverb which says, "Separate from him whom you cannot withstand," and forthwith departed from the country in disguise. On coming to another city and dismounting at a caravanserai, he walked to the market-place in search of provisions. Whilst thus engaged, he observed a youth of talent and science, around whom a crowd of people were collected, asking him for remedies. The youth in turn showed to each one the remedies for his complaint, and the means to recovery from his malady. Presently a woman made her appearance, bearing a white vase in her hand, which she showed to him. The youth said that the vase belonged to a Jew, which the woman confirmed. Afterwards he said that she had eaten that day half an egg and some curds, and this the woman also avowed. The young man next asked if the woman did not then reside in a filthy part of the city, and the woman answered affirmatively. Abu Sinna, observing the youth's superior talents, was astonished at his language and the remedies which he prescribed. The young man's eyes happened to meet those of Abu Sinna, and making him a secret sign of recognition, he addressed the Shaykh with deference and said, "You are he who has received that divine science, and are that unequalled and most perfectly excellent person, the Reis Abu Ali bin Sinna, who fled from Ispahan through fear of the Sultan Alai ed Daulet, and are come to this place with the intention of residing here." Then feeling kindly towards the Shaykh, he left all his business, kissed the Shaykh's feet, took his hands in his, and led him to his own house. After receiving from the young man all the usual attendance of a servant, the Shaykh asked him whence he had drawn his conclusions, and how he knew that the vase belonged to a Jew. The youth replied, "I observed the old woman's tunic, and knew from its marks that she was a Jewess, and I judged that the vase also belonged to one of the same people. Her dress was soiled with eggs and with curdled milk, and I knew that she must have eaten of both these things. Moreover, knowing that the Jew quarter at this time is a filthy place, I remarked that it was unclean. "But," said the sheykh, "how did you become acquainted with me and my profession?" The youth said in reply, "Knowing the envy of Alai at Dawlet, the circumstance of your having fled from him is a proof of the renown of your excellence, and that your sagacity and mental powers must be as bright as the sun in the heavens. I have heard too of the good qualities with which you are gifted, and I beheld on your noble front the characteristics of those traits which beamed upon me like the midday sun, from all of which I felt assured that you were the celebrated physician Abu Sina. I likewise knew that the Sultan could not bear to be separated from you for a moment, and therefore was convinced that you must have left him by your own desire and against his will." The young man next bent the knee of politeness before the sheykh, and thanked God for allowing him to meet with such a man. The sheykh then said, "What have you to ask of me? Tell me your wishes, and as far as my destiny permits, I will endeavor to promote them." The intelligent youth replied, "It is impossible that you should remain separated from the Sultan, and what I ask from you is, that when you again appear before him, you will relate the occurrences which you have witnessed, and obtain me a place in his service, even as one of his most humble attendants." Some days after this, a man came to the sheykh on the part of the Sultan, who begged his pardon for the past, and invited him to return to his palace. The sheykh took the youth with him, and on reaching the Sultan, related what he had witnessed respecting him, wherefore the Sultan forthwith appointed him to be one of his own pages. Section 32.
Section 33 of Library of the World's Best Mystery and Detective Stories, Volume 6. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Reading by Lars Rolander. Library of the World's Best Mystery and Detective Stories, Volume 6, by Julian Hawthorne, Editor. Section 33. A Conjurer's Confession, Part 1, by Monsieur Robert Houdin. Self-training. Sleight-of-hand theories alone cannot explain the mysteries of magic as practiced by that eminent Frenchman who revolutionized the entire art, and who was finally called upon to help his government out of a difficulty, Robert Houdin. The success of his most famous performances hung not only on an incredible dexterity, but also on high ingenuity and moral courage, as the following pages from his memoirs will prove to the reader. The story begins when the young man of 20 was laboring patiently as apprentice to a watchmaker. In order to aid my progress and to afford me relaxation, my master recommended me to study some treatises on mechanics in general, and on clockmaking in particular. As this suited my taste exactly, I gladly assented, and I was devoting myself passionately to this attractive study, when a circumstance, apparently most simple, suddenly decided my future life by revealing to me a vocation whose mysterious resources must open a vast field for my inventive and fanciful ideas. One evening I went into a bookseller's shop to buy Berthoud's Treatise on Clockmaking, which I knew he had. The tradesman, being engaged at the moment on matters more important, took down 2 volumes from the shelves and handed them to me without ceremony. On returning home, I sat down to peruse my treatise conscientiously. But judge of my surprise when I read on the back of one of the volumes, "Scientific Amusements." Astonished at finding such a title on a professional work, I opened it impatiently, and on running through the table of contents, my surprise was doubled on reading these strange phrases: The way of performing tricks with the cards, how to guess a person's thoughts, to cut off a pigeon's head, to restore it to life, etc., etc. The bookseller had made a mistake. In his haste he had given me 2 volumes of the Encyclopedia instead of Berthoud. Fascinated, however, by the announcement of such marvels, I devoured the mysterious pages, and the further my reading advanced, the more I saw laid bare before me the secrets of an art for which I was unconsciously predestined. I fear I shall be accused of exaggeration, or at least not be understood by many of my readers, when I say that this discovery caused me the greatest joy I had ever experienced. At this moment a secret presentiment warned me that success, perhaps glory, would one day accrue to me in the apparent realization of the marvelous and impossible. And fortunately these presentiments did not err. The resemblance between 2 books and the hurry of a bookseller were the commonplace causes of the most important event in my life. It may be urged that different circumstances might have suggested this profession to me at a later date. It is probable, but then I should have had no time for it. Would any workman, artisan, or tradesman give up a certainty, however slight it may be, to yield to a passion which would be surely regarded as a mania? Hence my irresistible penchant for the mysterious could only be followed at this precise period of my life. How often since have I blessed this providential error, without which I should have probably vegetated as a country watchmaker. My life would have been spent in gentle monotony. I should have been spared many sufferings, emotions, and shocks. But, on the other hand, what lively sensations, what profound delight would have been sacrificed! I was eagerly devouring every line of the magic book which described the astounding tricks. My head was aglow, and I at times gave way to thoughts which plunged me in ecstasy. The author gave a very plain explanation of his tricks. Still he committed the error of supposing his readers possessed of the necessary skill to perform them. Now I was entirely deficient in this skill, and though most desirous of acquiring it, I found nothing in the book to indicate the means. I was in the position of a man who attempts to copy a picture without possessing the slightest notion of drawing and painting. In the absence of a professor to instruct me, I was compelled to create the principles of the science I wished to study. In the first place, I recognized the fundamental principle of sleight of hand, that the organs performing the principal part are the sight and touch. I saw that in order to attain any degree of perfection, the professor must develop these organs to their fullest extent, for in his exhibitions he must be able to see everything that takes place around him at half a glance, and execute his deceptions with unfailing dexterity. I had been often struck by the ease with which pianists can read and perform at sight the most difficult pieces. I saw that by practice it would be possible to create a certainty of perception and facility of touch, rendering it easy for the artist to attend to several things simultaneously, while his hands were busy employed with some complicated task. This faculty I wished to acquire and apply to sleight of hand. Still, as music could not afford me the necessary elements, I had recourse to the juggler's art, in which I hoped to meet with an analogous result. It is well known that the trick with the balls wonderfully improves the touch, but does it not improve the vision at the same time? In fact, when a juggler throws into the air 4 balls, crossing each other in various directions, he requires an extraordinary power of sight to follow the direction his hands have given to each of the balls. At this period a corn cutter resided at Blois, who possessed the double talent of juggling and extracting corns with a skill worthy of the lightness of his hands. Still, with both these qualities, he was not rich, and being aware of that fact, I hoped to obtain lessons from him at a price suited to my modest finances. In fact, for 10 francs he agreed to initiate me in the juggling art. I practiced with so much zeal and progressed so rapidly that in less than a month I had nothing more to learn. At least I knew as much as my master, with the exception of corn cutting, the monopoly in which I left him. I was able to juggle with 4 balls at once, but this did not satisfy my ambition. So I placed a book before me, and while the balls were in the air, I accustomed myself to read without any hesitation. This will probably seem to my readers very extraordinary, but I shall surprise them still more when I say that I have just amused myself by repeating this curious experiment. Though 30 years have elapsed since the time of which I am writing, and though I scarcely once touched the balls during that period, I can still manage to read with ease while keeping 3 balls up. The practice of this trick gave my fingers a remarkable degree of delicacy and certainty, while my eye was at the same time acquiring a promptitude of perception that was quite marvelous. Presently I shall have to speak of the service this rendered me in my experiment of second sight. After having thus made my hands supple and docile, I went on straight to sleight of hand, and I more especially devoted myself to the manipulation of cards and palmistry. The operation requires a great deal of practice, for while the hand is held apparently open, balls, corks, lumps of sugar, coins, etc., must be held unseen, the fingers remaining perfectly free and limber. Owing to the little time at my disposal, the difficulties connected with these new experiments would have been insurmountable had I not found a mode of practicing without neglecting my business. It was the fashion in those days to wear coats with large pockets on the hips, called à la propriétaire. So whenever my hands were not otherwise engaged, they slipped naturally into my pockets, and set to work with cards, coins, or one of the objects I have mentioned. It will be easily understood how much time I gained by this. Thus, for instance, when out on errands, my hands could be at work on both sides. At dinner, I often ate my soup with one hand, while I was learning to sauter la coupe with the other. In short, the slightest moment of relaxation was devoted to my favorite pursuit. End of Section 33. Read by Lars Rolander. Section 34 of Library of the World's Best Mystery and Detective Stories, Volume 6. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Reading by Lars Rolander. Library of the World's Best Mystery and Detective Stories, Volume 6, by Julian Hawthorne, Editor. Section 34. A Conjurer's Confession, Part 2, by Monsieur Robert Houdin. Second Sight. 1,000 more trials of patience and perseverance finally brought to the conjurer a Parisian theater and an appreciative clientele, but he never ceased to labor and improve the quality of his marvelous effects. The experiment, however, to which I owed my reputation was one inspired by the fantastic god whom Pascal attributes all the discoveries of this sublunary world. It was chance that led me straight to the invention of second sight. My 2 children were playing one day in the drawing room at a game they had invented for their own amusement. The younger had bandaged his elder brother's eyes, and made him guess the objects he touched, and when the latter happened to guess right, they changed places. This simple game suggested to me the most complicated idea that ever crossed my mind. Pursued by the notion, I ran and shut myself up in my workroom, and was fortunately in that happy state when the mind follows easily the combinations traced by fancy. I rested my head in my hands, and in my excitement laid down the first principles of second sight. My readers will remember the experiment suggested to me formerly by the pianist's dexterity, and the strange faculty I succeeded in attaining. I could read while juggling with 4 balls. Thinking seriously of this, I fancied that this perception by appreciation might be susceptible of equal development if I applied its principles to the memory and the mind. I resolved, therefore, on making some experiments with my son Emile, and in order to make my young assistant understand the nature of the exercise we were going to learn, I took a domino, the 5/4 for instance, and laid it before him. Instead of letting him count the points of the 2 numbers, I requested the boy to tell me the total at once. 9, he said. Then I added another domino, the quarter tray. That makes 16, he said, without any hesitation. I stopped the first lesson here. The next day we succeeded in counting at a single glance 4 dominoes, the day after 6, and thus we at length were enabled to give instantaneously the product of a dozen dominoes. This result obtained, we applied ourselves to a far more difficult task, over which we spent a month. My son and I passed rapidly before a toy shop, or any other displaying a variety of wares, and cast an attentive glance upon it. A few steps farther on we drew paper and pencil from our pockets, and tried which could describe the greater number of objects seen in passing. I must own that my son reached a perfection far greater than mine, for he could often write down 40 objects, while I could scarce reach 30. Often feeling vexed at this defeat, I would return to the shop and verify his statement, but he rarely made a mistake. My male readers will certainly understand the possibility of this, but they will recognize the difficulty. As for my lady readers, I am convinced beforehand they will not be of the same opinion, for they daily perform far more astounding feats. Thus, for instance, I can safely assert that a lady seeing another pass at full speed in a carriage will have had time to analyze her toilet from her bonnet to her shoes, and be able to describe not only the fashion and quality of the stuffs, but also say if the lace be real or only machine-made. I have known ladies do this. This natural or acquired faculty among ladies, but which my son and I had only gained by constant practice, was of great service in my performances, for while I was executing my tricks I could see everything that passed around me, and thus prepare to foil any difficulties presented me. This exercise had given me, so to speak, the power of following 2 ideas simultaneously, and nothing is more favorable in conjuring than to be able to think at the same time both of what you are saying and of what you are doing. I eventually acquired such a knack in this that I frequently invented new tricks while going through my performances. One day even I made a bet I would solve a problem in mechanics while taking my part in conversation. We were talking of the pleasure of a country life, and I calculated during this time the quantity of wheels and pinions, as well as the necessary cogs, to produce certain revolutions required, without once failing in my reply. This slight explanation will be sufficient to show what is the essential basis of second sight, and I will add that a secret and unnoticeable correspondence existed between my son and myself, by which I could announce to him the name, nature, and bulk of objects handed me by spectators. As none understood my mode of action, they were tempted to believe in something extraordinary. And indeed my son Emile, then aged 12, possessed all the essential qualities to produce this opinion, for his pale, intellectual, and ever thoughtful face represented the type of a boy gifted with some supernatural power. 2 months were incessantly employed in erecting the scaffolding of our tricks, and when we were quite confident of being able to contend against the difficulties of such an undertaking, we announced the first representation of Second Sight. On the 12th of February, 1846, I printed in the center of my bill the following singular announcement: Telegraphy. In this performance, Monsieur Robert Houdin's son, who is gifted with a marvelous second sight, after his eyes have been covered with a thick bandage, will designate every object presented to him by the audience. I cannot say whether this announcement attracted any spectators, for my room was constantly crowded. Still, I may affirm, what may seem very extraordinary, that the experiment of second sight, which afterwards became so fashionable, produced no effect on the first performance. I am inclined to believe that the spectators fancied themselves the dupes of accomplices, but I was much annoyed by the result, as I had built on the surprise I should produce. Still, having no reason to doubt its ultimate success, I was tempted to make a second trial, which turned out well. The next evening I noticed in my room several persons who had been present on the previous night, and I felt they had come a second time to assure themselves of the reality of the experiment. It seems they were convinced, for my success was complete, and amply compensated for my former disappointment. I especially remember a mark of singular approval with which one of my pit audience favored me. My son had named to him several objects he offered in succession, but not feeling satisfied, my incredulous friend, rising, as if to give more importance to the difficulty he was about to present, handed me an instrument peculiar to cloth merchants, and employed to count the number of threads. Acquiescing in his wish, I said to my boy, "What do I hold in my hand?" "It is an instrument to judge the fineness of cloth, and called a thread counter." "By Jove!" my spectator said energetically, "it is marvelous. If I had paid 10 francs to see it, I should not begrudge them." From this moment my room was much too small, and was crowded every evening. Still, success is not entirely rose colored, and I could easily narrate many disagreeable scenes produced by the reputation I had of being a sorcerer. But I will only mention one, which forms a resume of all I pass over. A young lady of elegant manners paid me a visit one day, and although her face was hidden by a thick veil, my practiced eyes perfectly distinguished her features. She was very pretty. My incognita would not consent to sit down till she was assured we were alone, and that I was the real Robert Houdin. I also seated myself, and assuming the attitude of a man prepared to listen, I bent slightly to my visitor, as if awaiting her pleasure to explain to me the object of her mysterious visit. To my great surprise, the young lady, whose manner betrayed extreme emotion, maintained the most profound silence, and I began to find the visit very strange, and was on the point of forcing an explanation at any hazard, when the fair unknown timidly ventured these words: "Good heavens, sir, I know not how you will interpret my visit." Here she stopped, and let her eyes sink with a very embarrassed air; then, making a violent effort, she continued: "What I have to ask of you, sir, is very difficult to explain." "Speak, madam, I beg," I said politely, "and I will try to guess what you cannot explain to me." And I began asking myself what this reserve meant. "In the first place," the young lady said in a low voice, and looking round her, "I must tell you confidentially that I loved. My love was returned, and I am betrayed." At the last word the lady raised her head, overcame the timidity she felt, and said in a firm and assured voice: "Yes, sir, yes, I am betrayed, and for that reason I have come to you." "Really, madam," I said, much surprised at this strange confession, "I do not see how I can help you in such a matter." "Oh, sir, I entreat you," said my fair visitor, clasping her hands, "I implore you not to abandon me." I had great difficulty in keeping my countenance, and yet I felt an extreme curiosity to know the history concealed behind this mystery. "Calm yourself, madam," I remarked in a tone of tender sympathy. "Tell me what you would of me, and if it be in my power—" "If it be in your power," the young lady said quickly, "why, nothing is more easy, sir." "Explain yourself, madam." "Well, sir, I wish to be avenged." "In what way?" "How? You know better than I, sir. Must I teach you? You have in your powers means to—" "I, madam?" "Yes, sir, you, for you are a sorcerer, and cannot deny it." At this word sorcerer I was much inclined to laugh, but I was restrained by the incognita's evident emotion. Still wishing to put an end to a scene which was grown ridiculous, I said in a politely ironical tone, "Unfortunately, madam, you give me a title I never possessed." "How, sir!" the young woman exclaimed in a quick tone. "You will not allow you are?" "A sorcerer, madam? Oh, no, I will not." "You will not?" "No, 1,000 times no, madam." At these words my visitor rose hastily, muttered a few incoherent words, appeared suffering from terrible emotion, and then drawing near me with flaming eyes and passionate gestures, repeated, "Ah, you will not! Very good. I now know what I have to do." Stupefied by such an outbreak, I looked at her fixedly and began to suspect the cause of her extraordinary conduct. "There are two modes of acting," she said with terrible volubility, "toward people who devote themselves to magic arts, entreaty and menaces. You would not yield to the first of these means, hence I must employ the second. Stay," she added, "perhaps this will induce you to speak." And lifting up her cloak, she laid her hand on the hilt of a dagger passed through her girdle. At the same time she suddenly threw back her veil, and displayed features in which all the signs of rage and madness could be traced. No longer having a doubt as to the person I had to deal with, my first movement was to rise and stand on my guard. But this first feeling overcome, I repented the thought of a struggle with the unhappy woman, and determined on employing a method almost always successful with those deprived of reason. I pretended to accede to her wishes. "If it be so, madam, I yield to your request. Tell me what you require." "I have told you, sir. I wish for vengeance, and there is only one method to—" Here there was a fresh interruption, and the young lady, calmed by my apparent submission, as well as embarrassed by the request she had to make of me, became again timid and confused. "Well, madam?" "Well, sir, I know not how to tell you, how to explain to you, but I fancy there are certain means, 13 spells, which render it impossible for a man to be unfaithful." "I now understand what you wish, madam. It is a certain magic practice employed in the Middle Ages. Nothing is easier, and I will satisfy you." Decided on playing the farce to the end, I took down the largest book I could find in my library, turned over the leaves, stopped at a page which I pretended to scan with profound attention, and then addressing the lady, who followed all my movements anxiously, "Madam," I said confidentially, "the spell I am going to perform renders it necessary for me to know the name of the person. Have the kindness then to tell it me." "Julian," she said in a faint voice. With all the gravity of a real sorcerer, I solemnly thrust a pin through a lighted candle, and pronounced some cabalistic words; after which, blowing out the candle, and turning to the poor creature, I said, "Madam, it is done. Your wish is accomplished." "Oh, thank you, sir," she replied with the expression of the profoundest gratitude. And at the same moment she laid a purse on the table and rushed away. I ordered my servant to follow her to her house, and obtain all the information he could about her, and I learned she had been a widow for a short time, and that the loss of an adored husband had disturbed her reason. The next day I visited her relatives, and returning them the purse, I told them the scene, the details of which the reader has just perused. This scene, with some others that preceded and followed it, compelled me to take measures to guard myself against bores of every description. I could not dream, as formerly, of exiling myself in the country, but I employed a similar resource. This was to shut myself up in my workroom, and organize around me a system of defense against those whom I called, in my ill temper, thieves of time. I daily received visits from persons who were utter strangers to me. Some were worth knowing, but the majority, gaining an introduction under the most futile pretexts, only came to kill a portion of their leisure time with me. It was necessary to distinguish these tares from the wheat, and this is the arrangement I made. When one of these gentlemen rang at my door, an electric communication struck a bell in my workroom. I was thus warned and put on my guard. My servant opened the door, and as is customary inquired the visitor's name, while I, for my part, laid my ear to a tube, arranged for the purpose, which conveyed to me every word. If, according to his reply, I thought it as well not to receive him, I pressed a button, and a white mark that appeared in a certain part of the hall announced I was not at home to him. My servant then stated I was out, and begged the visitor to apply to the manager. Sometimes it happened that I erred in my judgment, and regretted having granted an audience. But I had another mode of shortening a bore's visit. I had placed behind the sofa on which I sat an electric spring, communicating with the bell my servant could hear. In case of need, and while talking, I threw my arm carelessly over the back of the sofa, touching the spring, and the bell rang. Then my servant, playing a little farce, opened the front door, rang the bell, which could be heard from the room where I sat, and came to tell me that Monsieur X, a name invented for the occasion, wished to speak to me. I ordered Monsieur X to be shown into an adjoining room, and it was very rare that my bore did not raise the siege. No one can form an idea how much time I gained by this happy arrangement, or how many times I blessed my imagination and the celebrated savant to whom the discovery of galvanism is due. This feeling can be easily explained, for my time was of inestimable value. I husbanded it like a treasure, and never sacrificed it unless the sacrifice might help me to discover new experiments destined to stimulate public curiosity. To support my determination in making my researches, I had ever before me this maxim: it is more difficult to support admiration than to excite it. And this other, an apparent corollary of the preceding: the fashion an artist enjoys can only last as his talent daily increases. Nothing increases a professional man's merit so much as the possession of an independent fortune. This truth may be coarse, but it is indubitable. Not only was I convinced of these principles of high economy, but I also knew that a man must strive to profit by the fickle favor of the public, which equally descends if it does not rise. Hence I worked my reputation as much as I could. In spite of my numerous engagements, I found means to give performances in all the principal theaters, though great difficulties frequently arose, as my performance did not end till 10:30, and I could only fulfill my other engagements after that hour. 11 o'clock was generally the hour fixed for my appearance on a strange stage, and my readers may judge of the speed required to proceed to the theater in so short a time, and make my preparations. It is true that the moments were as well counted as employed, and my curtain had hardly fallen than, rushing toward the stairs, I got before my audience, and jumped into a vehicle that bore me off at full speed. But this fatigue was nothing compared to the emotion occasionally produced by an error in the time that was to elapse between my two performances. I remember that one night, having to wind up the performances at the Vaudeville, the stage manager miscalculated the time the pieces would take in performing, and found himself much in advance. He sent off an express to warn me that the curtain had fallen, and I was anxiously expected. Can my readers comprehend my wretchedness? My experiments, of which I could omit none, would occupy another quarter of an hour. But instead of indulging in useless recriminations, I resigned myself and continued my performance, though I was a prey to frightful anxiety. While speaking, I fancied I could hear the cadenced yell of the public, to which the famous song, Des Lampions, des Lampions, was set. Thus, either through preoccupation or a desire to end sooner, I found when my performance was over I had gained 5 minutes out of the quarter of an hour. Assuredly, it might be called the quarter of an hour's grace. To jump into a carriage and drive to the Place de la Bourse was the affair of an instant. Still, 20 minutes had elapsed since the curtain fell, and that was an enormous time. My son Emile and I proceeded up the actors' stairs at full speed, but on the first step we had heard the cries, whistling, and stamping of the impatient audience. What a prospect! I knew that frequently, either right or wrong, the public treated an artist, no matter whom, very harshly, to remind him of punctuality. That sovereign always appears to have on its lips the words of another monarch, I was obliged to wait. However, we hurried up the steps leading to the stage. The stage manager, who had been watching, on hearing our hurried steps, cried from the landing, "Is that you, Monsieur Audin?" "Yes, sir, yes." "Raise the curtain," the same voice shouted. "Wait, wait, it is Imp." My breath would not allow me to finish my objection. I fell on a chair, unable to move. "Come, Monsieur Houdin," the manager said, "do go on the stage. The curtain is up, and the public are so impatient." The door at the back of the stage was open, but I could not pass through it. Fatigue and emotion nailed me to the spot. Still an idea occurred to me which saved me from the popular wrath. "Go on to the stage, my boy," I said to my son, "and prepare all that is wanting for the second sight trick." The public allowed themselves to be disarmed by this youth, whose face inspired a sympathizing interest, and my son, after gravely bowing to the audience, quietly made his slight preparations, that is to say, he carried an ottoman to the front of the stage and placed on a neighboring table a slate, some chalk, a pack of cards, and a bandage. This slight delay enabled me to recover my breath and calm my nerves, and I advanced in my turn with an attempt to assume the stereotyped smile, in which I signally failed, as I was so agitated. The audience at first remained silent, then their faces gradually unwrinkled, and soon, one or two claps having been ventured, they were carried away and peace was made. I was well rewarded, however, for this terrible ordeal, as my second sight never gained a more brilliant triumph. An incident greatly enlivened the termination of my performance. A spectator, who had evidently come on purpose to embarrass us, had tried in vain for some minutes to baffle my son's clairvoyance, when turning to me he said, laying marked stress on his words, "As your son is a soothsayer, of course he can guess the number of my stall." The importunate spectator doubtless hoped to force us into a confession of our impotence, for he covered his number, and the adjacent seats being occupied, it was apparently impossible to read the numbers. But I was on my guard against all surprises, and my reply was ready. Still, in order to profit as much as possible by the situation, I feigned to draw back. "You know, sir," I said, feigning an embarrassed air, "that my son is neither sorcerer nor diviner. He reads through my eyes, and hence I have given this experiment the name of second sight. As I cannot see the number of your stall, and the seats close to you are occupied, my son cannot tell it's you." "Ah, I was certain of it," my persecutor said in triumph, and turning to his neighbors, "I told you I would pin him." Oh, sir, you're not generous in your victory, I said in my turn in a tone of mockery. Take care if you pique my son's vanity too sharply. He may solve your problem, though it is so difficult. I defy him, said the spectator, leaning firmly against the back of his seat to hide the number better. Yes, yes, I defy him. You believe it to be difficult, then? I will grant more. It is impossible. Well, then, sir, that is a stronger reason for us to try it. You will not be angry if we triumph in our turn? I added with a petulant smile. Come, sir, we understand evasions of that sort. I repeat it. I challenge you both. The public found great amusement in this debate, and patiently awaited its issue. Emile, I said to my son, prove to this gentleman that nothing can escape your second sight. It is number 69, the boy answered immediately. Noisy and hearty applause rose from every part of the theater, in which our opponent joined for confessing his defeat. He exclaimed as he clapped his hands, "It is astounding! Magnificent!" The way I succeeded in finding out the number of the stall was this. I knew beforehand that in all theaters where the stalls are divided down the center by a passage, the uneven numbers are on the right, and the even on the left. As at the Vaudeville each row was composed of 10 stalls, it followed that on the right hand the several rows must begin with 1, 21, 41, and so on, increasing by 20 each. Guided by this, I had no difficulty in discovering that my opponent was seated in number 69, representing the 5th stall in the 4th row. I had prolonged the conversation for the double purpose of giving more brilliancy to my experiment and gaining time to make my researches. Thus I applied my process of two simultaneous thoughts, to which I have already alluded. As I am now explaining matters, I may as well tell my readers some of the artifices that added material brilliancy to the second sight. I have already said this experiment was the result of a material communication between myself and my son, which no one could detect. Its combinations enabled us to describe any conceivable object, but though this was a splendid result, I saw that I should soon encounter unheard of difficulties in executing it. The experiment of second sight always formed the termination of my performance. Each evening I saw unbelievers arrive with all sorts of articles to triumph over a secret which they could not unravel. Before going to see Robert Houdin's son, a council was held in which an object that must embarrass the father was chosen. Among these were half-effaced antique medals, minerals, books printed in characters of every description, living and dead languages, coats of arms, microscopic objects, etc. But what caused me the greatest difficulty was in finding out the contents of parcels, often tied with a string or even sealed up. But I had managed to contend successfully against all these attempts to embarrass me. I opened boxes, purses, pocketbooks, etc., with great ease and unnoticed while appearing to be engaged on something quite different. Were a sealed packet offered me, I cut a small slit in the paper with the nail of my left thumb, which I always purposely kept very long and sharp, and thus discovered what it contained. One essential condition was excellent sight, and that I possessed to perfection. I owed it originally to my old trade, and practice daily improved it. An equally indispensable necessity was to know the name of every object offered me. It was not enough to say, for instance, "It is a coin," but my son must give its technical name, its value, the country in which it was current, and the year in which it was struck. Thus, for instance, if an English crown were handed me, my son was expected to state that it was struck in the reign of George IV, and had an intrinsic value of 6 francs 18 centimes. Aided by an excellent memory, we had managed to classify in our heads the name and value of all foreign money. we could also describe a coat of arms in heraldic terms. Thus, on the arms of the house of X being handed me, my son would reply, "Field gules with 2 crosiers argent in pale." This knowledge was very useful to us in the saloons of the Faubourg Saint Germain, where we were frequently summoned. I had also learnt the characters, though unable to translate a word, of an infinity of languages, such as Chinese, Russian, Turkish, Greek, Hebrew, etc. We knew too the names of all surgical instruments, so that a surgical pocketbook, however complicated it might be, could not embarrass us. Lastly, I had very sufficient knowledge of mineralogy, precious stones, antiquities, and curiosities, but I had at my command every possible resource for acquiring these studies, as one of my dearest and best friends, Aristide Le Carpentier, a learned antiquary and uncle of the talented composer of the same name, had and still has a cabinet of antique curiosities, which makes the keepers of the imperial museums fierce with envy. My son and I spent many long days in learning here names and dates, of which we afterwards made a learned display. Le Carpentier taught me many things, and among others he described various signs by which to recognize old coins when the die is worn off. Thus a Trajan, a Tiberius, or a Marcus Aurelius became as familiar to me as a 5-franc piece. Owing to my old trade, I could open a watch with ease, and do it with one hand, so as to be able to read the maker's name without the public suspecting it. Then I shut up the watch again, and the trick was ready. My son managed the rest of the business. But that power of memory which my son possessed in an eminent degree certainly did us the greatest service. When we went to private houses, he needed only a very rapid inspection in order to know all the objects in a room, as well as the various ornaments worn by the spectators, such as chatelaines, pins, eyeglasses, fans, brooches, rings, bouquets, etc. He thus could describe these objects with the greatest ease when I pointed them out to him by our secret communication. Here is an instance. One evening at a house in the Chaussée d'Antin, and at the end of a performance which had been as successful as it was loudly applauded, I remembered that, while passing through the next room to the one we were now in, I had begged my son to cast a glance at a library and remember the titles of some of the books, as well as the order they were arranged in. No one had noticed this rapid examination. "To end the second sight experiment, sir," I said to the master of the house, "I will prove to you that my son can read through a wall. Will you lend me a book?" I was naturally conducted to the library in question, which I pretended now to see for the first time, and I laid my finger on a book. "Emile," I said to my son, "what is the name of this work?" "It is Buffon," he replied quickly. "And the one by its side?" an incredulous spectator hastened to ask. "On the right or left?" my son asked. "On the right," the speaker said, having a good reason for choosing this book, for the lettering was very small. "The Travels of Anacharsis the Younger," the boy replied. "But," he added, "had you asked the name of the book on the left, sir, I should have said Lamartine's Poetry. A little to the right of this row I see Crébillon's works, below 2 volumes of Fleureu's Memoirs," and my son thus named a dozen books before he stopped. The spectators had not said a word during this description, as they felt so amazed. But when the experiment had ended, all complimented us by clapping their hands. End of section 34. Read by Lars Rolander.